So in the last lesson, we looked at how we can apply CSS styling through the use of our style sheet. Now in this lesson, I want to show you a slightly less used, but also quite a useful way of adding styling. And that's through the use of inline styles. Now here's the starting project. So go ahead and fork it. And once you've done that, let's start adding some inline styles. So if this was in fact HTML, you know already that you can add styling inline just through the use of the style attribute. So I could say something like color is red. Now, unfortunately though, this is not HTML, and this is something that I keep reiterating because it looks so similar to HTML and it's doing so much behind the scenes for you, converting this into JavaScript, that sometimes even I forget that I'm actually inside a JSX file. So when we write this code, we immediately get an error telling us that the style property expects a mapping from style properties to values, not a string. And it tells you how it wants you to write this instead. So what's going on here? Well, in this case, we're actually providing a string as the value to the style attribute. And this would work fine if this was HTML, but in JavaScript, it wants this value for the style property as a JavaScript object. Let's just remind ourselves, JavaScript objects look like this. They exist in a set of curly braces, and then they have key value pairs. So in this case, the key would be the word color, and this would behave a bit like a variable. So it's not a string. Whereas the value in terms of CSS anyways, is going to be a string. So in this case, it'll be red. And each of these key value pairs in a JavaScript object are separated by commas, not semicolons as you would see in the style sheet. But in my case, I just want to add a single style, which is to change the color to red. And so I'm just going to collapse it down and see it as a simple version. Now let's go ahead and delete this string and try to insert this JavaScript object in as the value for this style property. Now remember though, whenever we want to inject some JavaScript into an HTML element in JSX, we have to wrap it inside a set of curly braces, right? So now that we've got our set of curly braces, then we can cut our JavaScript object and paste it inside. And our console finally stops screaming at us and accepts our code as valid. But this does end up looking very strange with two sets of curly braces. But this is all because the style property requires a value that is a JavaScript object. And that object, in order for it to be interpreted correctly inside an HTML element, has to have a set of curly braces around it. Instead of a normal expression, like say 2 plus 3, in this case, we're just replacing it with a JavaScript object. Now, you might ask, well, why would we do this, right? Because we've already learned about class-based styling. And we know that the React documentation, in fact, recommends to use class-based styling using the style sheet to change the appearance of your React elements. So why would we ever want to do this kind of inline styling? Well, there are certain cases where this is pretty useful, especially when you want styles for certain React elements to update on the fly. So while your app is up and running, if the user does something or the time changes or it's a different day or it's a different hour, you might want to trigger a change in your style, right? And you can do that really easily using inline styles. Let me show you what I mean. I'm going to cut my object and I'm going to save it inside a constant. I'm going to call it custom style and set it to equal this object. Now let's go ahead and expand it out again. And while I'm here, I'm going to add a couple more styles. And I want to point out that when you're using CSS properties, remember that they are kebab cased. So lowercase, lowercase separated by a hyphen. But in order to use these properties inside your JavaScript object, you have to convert those names to camel case. So for example, if we want to change the font size, instead of writing font-size, we would write font, and then it's a capital S and size. And then we can change the size to, say, 20 pixels. Remember that instead of semicolons, which you might be used to when you're writing CSS, we're going to be using commas because we're inside a JavaScript object. And instead of simply just writing out 20 pixels or red, the values for each of these key value pairs has to be a string. And that includes cases where you have spaces as the value. So for example, if I wanted to add a border, normally I would write, say, 1 pixel, solid black. Well, in this case, it's still exactly like this, but it has to be a string with each of these spaces preserved. Now that I've created my custom style constant, I can now insert this object inside here as the style. So I've got my curly braces denoting that I'm about to write some JavaScript, and I'm going to insert my custom style object right there. And as soon as that gets compiled, then you can see that we've got our H1 changing its font size, having a border, and changing its color, all because of this custom style. Now here's the interesting part. If at some point in our code something changes, let's say the user did something, or the day changed, or the time changed, it became morning to night, something happens, and we wanted to change the style of our H1, we don't have to touch any of our code in here. All we have to do is to just update the properties of our custom style object. So let's say that I decide to change its color to, instead of red, let's make it blue. And as soon as I hit save, you'll see that style gets immediately updated. So this means that our style can change on the go. And this is one of the biggest reasons why you would want to use inline styling. Now, I recommend having a play around with these CSS properties. So have a look at the documentation for all of the CSS properties and try to implement some of these other ones and convert them into a format that will get accepted by JSX so that you can see it rendered. And then have a play around with these objects. Maybe put the object back in line with the HTML elements in the JSX. Get used to that double curly brace syntax. And once you're happy and you're comfortable with inline properties in JSX, then head over to the next lesson where I've got a challenge for you where you're going to apply everything you've learned so far, and especially inline and class-based styles. As always, this file is going to be saved for you to mess around with in the course resources if you want to. And the best way of overcoming confusion or just getting used to these concepts is to just clear the slate and try to achieve what we've done in the lesson all by yourself, and then referring back to the final code if you need help. So have a play around with that, and I'll see you on the next lesson.